welcome everyone to our fourth and final event in the Social First Brand series, where we today explore subcultures and how to scale them. And there we go. So first of all, to introduce myself, my name is Essie. I'm head of strategy at Born Social. And with me today, I've got Sammy, who is a creative strategist. So he's responsible for taking the strategy and turning it into great social first ideas and pieces of content. And with me, I've got Shawnee, who is a brilliant senior social media manager. She is the official queen of reactivity at Born, so very close to communities and subcultures as well. So in terms of how we're running the event today, so I'll give you a quick intro to today's topic and introduce the kind of guiding principles of how to make the most of subcultures. And then Sammy and Shawnee will jump in and give you a lot more depth and examples of how brands can do it successfully as well. And then we'll round up with a Q&A. You'll see there's a Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. So please add any questions that you might have as we go through the slides, and we'll aim to answer as many of your questions as possible at the end. But without further ado, we'll get straight into it. So as mentioned, this is the fourth and final event in the Social First Brand series. So we'll be diving into the detail of our brand new white paper, which is the Social First Brand. It was released a month or so ago. You'll be able to download it in full on our website, on bornsocial.co.uk, if you so wish. There's loads of good stuff in there. And overall, it just aims to understand how to build these great social first brands, essentially those brands that we know will be successful tomorrow. And what the white paper does is it explores brand building, but in a kind of a new light. So it covers how, as the kind of digital and social spaces have been evolving over the last 10 or so years, and the communication streams that we know have become much more splintered, and it looks at how it makes it much harder to grow these memorable, cohesive brands that we know are so important. And in the white paper, we explore this through 4 different pillars. Full funnel on the top left there. It's all about how brands should balance their performance and brand activity. Then channel clusters. It's all about working across different channels, formats, and kind of consumer mindsets, and how to layer them to get to the best possible results. Building with community on the bottom left there. It's all about how communities are born and nurtured on social. And then finally, today's topic, scaling subcultures, which is all about identifying and scaling those subcultures effectively. And then when all of these things come together, they form the social first brand. And we've done events on the 3 other areas already. So if you want to find out more, head to our website, our blog section, or to our social profiles. You'll be able to find links to those recordings as well. There's loads of good stuff in there. But to kind of kick us off and to give everyone a better understanding of why we felt like subcultures were such an important part of understanding what social first brands need to be doing, I wanted to kick off with this question that we get asked more often than not, which is how to get into culture. So how do I show up in culture in a way that's relevant for my brand, but also that's relevant to the audience as well. And we know that brands are now looking much more actively and kind of purposefully at the culture that's happening around them, whether it's in entertainment or in fashion or what's happening in news, and kind of using that awareness on how to kind of inform how they should best position and integrate themselves into the world of their consumers. And this relevance to youth culture, or Gen Z culture, as we hear it called very often, and kind of be top of mind culture are now really seen as necessities really for brands to survive, not just thrive, but actually to survive. But as we all know, getting into culture and kind of answering this question isn't that simple. And that's because culture itself isn't simple. That's because culture actually is all of this. You know, it's the stuff that we talk about at the start of our Zoom calls or with our partners as we kind of sit on the sofa watching Netflix, doing nothing in the evenings these days. And from a cultural perspective, the world that we live in today, we know, is hugely different from that even 10 years ago when it comes to technology in particular. And there's all of these new ways of submitting and gaining cultural messages, and brands are really trying hard to keep up. I just saw someone pop in the chat asking whether this will be recorded. Yes, this is recorded, and we'll be sharing this later on our channels as well. But understanding kind of what that has to do with brand building and those, I guess, principles of brand building that we know so well. So we know that being culturally relevant is hugely important when it comes to brand building. And the reason why it's so crucial for brands to understand culture as a whole is that the fact that, as we know, strong brands don't exist on this kind of one-to-one basis, but they build this shared understanding of, you know, who they are and what they stand for in the world. And to achieve that shared understanding, brands really look for these moments within culture that they can use to gain meaning from. So that when you see something like this, for example, it brings to mind those specific brand attributes around quality and taste, and generally just the experience of having a pretty good time. And we all know that we share that same meaning about the particular brand. But when you look at it on the other side, so the culture side, in the last decade, as we well know, communication itself has become a lot more fragmented, a lot more immediate, and we don't share those kind of same big cultural moments or read the same newspaper headlines on Sunday mornings. This kind of monoculture or mainstream culture that, you know, has been driven by mass media no longer exists, or at least it doesn't exist to the extent that it used to. And in fact, some say that the last episode of Game of Thrones was the last kind of truly monocultural TV moment that we saw. And really, besides those kind of big sporting moments, these moments of national unity or cultural unity really just happen very few and far between these days. And I think what's important to note that when they do happen, so when there is this big kind of cultural moment, like the finale of Game of Thrones, this is what happens on social. So every brand tries to jump on that moment, trying to kind of leverage that important occasion to gain some sort of cultural credibility for their brand, which then often just creates a lot of noise and makes it really quite impossible to stand out for any individual brand. Which is exactly why we find that focusing on subcultures and scaling these subcultures instead of simply kind of tapping into that mainstream culture and waiting for those moments of unity is much more effective. And I think when talking about subcultures in general and trying to understand what they are, there's this common misconception that working with subcultures could be detrimental to reach and kind of broad messaging strategies, when in reality, what the internet has done is really allowed even those most niche groups to gain more popularity and kind of unite people who have a shared interest in them. If we look at channels like TikTok, for example, which we will later on today as well, we'll see that it absolutely does give those groups that type of reach that brands are looking for as well. Which just means that, you know, these subcultures now span different social platforms, different demographics, different geographic locations as well, building those, you know, valuable groups with broad reach as well. So I wanted to touch on a very brief definition on how this monoculture, mainstream culture, and subcultures differ. So monoculture, as we see it, is this homogeneous mainstream culture, which is often driven by mass media. And subculture is this smaller culture with a kind of shared collection of beliefs, values, traditions, or kind of type of rituals within a larger culture. And those people who are in a subculture, they have this shared identity and this interactive sense of we-ness as well. So a subculture isn't a trend, it's not a fashion or an aesthetic. It requires this collective agency, this shared identity to really qualify as a subculture. But however, I think when we talk about subcultures and kind of look at the evolution of them, the subcultures themselves have changed. So they are far more fragmented and fluid than they used to be as well. These days, you know, you can like heavy metal and Afrobeat, but dress in Urban Outfitters or kind of sports gear, which kind of really represents the mindset of younger generations and Gen Z in particular. And for example, if we look at the evolution of the hipster, so a kind of a great subculture from back in the day, and we will look at the simple hipster, which was, you know, flannel shirts, craft beer, fixies, and beards and tattoos. And today, that kind of concept and subculture is divided into so many different niches. So you've got the aesthetic art host there on the top, you've got your North Face gang, you've got your kind of small plate eating natural wine drinkers on the bottom there. And we've really seen this kind of splintering of culture. You know, subcultures becoming less about these massive groups and more about individuals and kind of microcosms of niche interests as well, which has obviously happened on social as well. You know, if we think back to the early days of social and social subcultures, it's quite hard not to think about MySpace, you know, outside that kind of big social hub before Facebook, that personalization the platform offered and the kind of heroing of different music streams made it really the perfect place for subcultures to not only live, but also to thrive. However, these days, we know loads more platforms, the kind of social and subculture scene has evolved massively. And they really do exist on basically all corners of the internet and social media these days. So anything you can think of probably has a subculture dedicated to it. And if we try to delve into each of those, or even kind of each platform today, we would literally be here all day. So we'll be looking at the very tip of the iceberg today, but just keep in mind that the possibilities of what you could be doing on social in regards to subcultures are quite literally endless. But to get us properly started, I wanted to bring some method to all of this madness of subcultures. We pulled together some guiding principles of how to approach and scale your chosen subcultures. So Sammy and Shawnee will cover these in detail, but to give you a very short overview, they are: number one, finding a natural fit between your brand and the subculture and committing to kind of embedding the brand in it, not just to be your toes in. Number two is this idea that brands need to add value, not simply extract it, and really understand what they can bring to the subculture. And number three is around these cultural codes, and that we'll talk a bit more as well. So you'll need to understand the way the subculture communicates and their different codes, and then build on them to show that you really get those people. But with that, I will hand over to the guys, and they'll take you through loads more examples.
Cheers, Essie. Hello, everyone. So yeah, I wanted to actually start by going way back, just to basically highlight the point that this idea of brand v subcultures is absolutely nothing new. So I was kind of like racking my brain trying to work out what the best example was to really kind of get this point across. And I landed on Michelin and the Michelin Guide. Now, I still think people overlook that connection between the Michelin Man, that's that sort of thing on the right made of tires, smoking that cigar, him, and then the fine dining sort of Michelin star restaurants of Mayfair and across the world. So that poses the question, you know, why on earth does a tire company publish the Michelin Guide? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Okay, Michelin began publishing what was called the Red Guide in about 1900. So this was both when like cars, food, tourism, they were both actually pretty novel luxuries. And its founders at the time hoped that this simple guidebook that offered info about hotels, restaurants, cafes, and so on would effectively lead people to drive more and as a result, buy more Michelin tires. And so that association with luxury food was born. And yeah, today the Michelin Guide is bigger than ever. It's literally taken over the world. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, really, if you think about it, it was a natural fit, right? So we do tires. People need tires to drive. People need to drive to go and eat. And bingo, you've landed on your subculture. You've landed on it. They figured out how their consumer uses or use their brand, and they thought about an alternative use outside of just the obvious, we sell tires, they're really tough and also shiny. They nailed it. So my question, I guess, for you guys is like, what would be your brand's natural fit? Like, have a think about it. So as I go through these points, just have that in the back of your mind. What's that natural fit? There might be a few different options, but it's a really good thing to have front of mind. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, natural fit. So does it make sense for me to be here? So I've got a couple of examples of natural fits that I want to run through now. So you can get an idea of how to start thinking about what subculture your brand or business might be able to explore, and hopefully just some nice inspiration to take away with you. So I'm going to kick off with Fred Perry, because these guys have been one of the absolute kings of UK youth subculture over the past 50 years or so. And what Fred Perry have done recently is super cool. So originally a tennis brand, of course, Fred Perry was a British tennis player. And I think like the mods and the punks of the 60s, 70s spontaneously started to adopt the brand of their own. I think they released the white polo shirt in a variety of colors, and I think that was enough for the punks to pounce on it. And yeah, ever since it's grown and grown. But as a result of that, in its heritage, it has this connection to, you know, indie music, Britishness, anti-establishment, and also this idea of creativity. You know, the whole idea of punks and mods was just young people expressing themselves. So now they've recognized that and they've got them in the place where they are now. Next slide, thanks. And over the last couple of years, they've launched this whole new wing of their brand, conveniently called Subculture. So it's what they call a new music initiative, which basically seeks to put new upcoming artists at the forefront of their content, but also, you know, support them, promote them, whilst continuing to be present alongside the country's most iconic musicians. So yes, it's worth noting that all their artists featured are dressed in Fred Perry gear, but that's not really the point. Point is that they found their natural fit. They've recognized where they belong in British culture, you know, with this sort of non-commercial alternative music subculture, and are fully committed to making rich content around that very topic. So it's one thing to sort of recognize you belong in a subculture and appreciate that, and it's another thing to act on it. And look, they've not just dipped their toes in, they've gone the full hog, which is amazing. Next slide, thanks. And yeah, I think this quote summarizes it perfectly. Fred Perry is not just a clothing brand, it's a lot more. Fred Perry is a lifestyle, a symbol to be used with caution, not only a fashion trend. Fred Perry is a sign of belonging, like punk's mohawk haircut or skinhead's boots. That little laurel crown on the polo shirt encloses a universe of music, rebellion, and street life by which the kids could and still can recognize and tell the world they are. And just on that, actually, that's then allowed them to take that sort of core subculture belief and go global with it, which is why I put that example in the bottom left. They've tapped into a really unique underground community in China because they have a right to play there because of all this work they put in. Next slide, thanks. Cool. And because you might think that Fred Perry might be a little too obvious, I wanted to highlight another natural fit that feels almost a polar opposite to punks and indie and mohawks and all that jazz. And that's Squarespace and their long-term commitment to its side hustle subculture. So Squarespace, who are effectively a do-it-yourself website building tool, have done an absolutely amazing job of committing to this side hustles as a way of helping them to land their core brief, which is making your 5 to 9 full time, of which actually this year they got actual Dolly Parton to record an actual song called 5 to 9, which by the way is exactly like the original, just with those two swapped round. Next slide, thanks. So yeah, it's a long-term commitment as they've been launching executions under this for years, 2015, I think, including such things as online exhibitions. So you can see there the browser history campaign, which basically celebrated all those freelancers, startups, creative individuals who just made the best of 2020's awful lockdown. And then among other things, a big focus on actual actionable advice. So the self-made series that you can see there on things such as how to grow side hustles into businesses, actually layering those interpretations with case studies and success stories all across their social channels. So a real natural fit and a really great example of a brand that adding genuine value to its audience, and we'll come back to that later. Next slide.
Cool. So just going to chat you through the next kind of pillar, which is committing to a niche. So committing to a niche is super important when it comes to scaling subcultures. Nobody likes a brand that kind of dips in and out of various subcultures without it feeling relevant to them, authentic, or to some mutual value. So there's probably no better place to think of right now when you think of niches than TikTok. If you're someone who's been on TikTok for a while now, at some point you've either heard someone say to you or you've seen a TikTok about it. Which side of TikTok are you on? Are you on elite TikTok? Are you on straight or alt TikTok? There's so many of these kind of questions going around. And what that essentially means is when you join TikTok, you're served very standardized videos. So everything from dance content to lip syncing, pranks, very viral videos with, you know, 1 million+ engagements. That's your straight TikTok. That's kind of the bread and butter. But once you kind of sink into a TikTok hole, which probably many of us have done, where you accidentally spend, you know, hours just scrolling and scrolling, you'll start to notice it gets a little bit weirder. It gets more specific, and you start to think, how have I ended up here? So you have different places, like there's Frogs TikTok, Draco Malfoy TikTok, Cottage TikTok, Beans TikTok, like anything that you could possibly think of, there is a subculture and a whole talk dedicated to it, which is pretty crazy. But I think what's so interesting about it is the more that you watch and engage with these videos, the more that almost snowballs, and you end up staying on that side of TikTok. You find more people that talk about it, and in turn, if it's something you're interested in, you'll soon find that you're participating and creating your own content as well. So probably no, I guess, bigger example of this that's relevant is the modern witchcraft movement. So witch talk is a pretty big subculture on TikTok, and it's growing kind of massively, constantly. And obviously witchcraft is absolutely nothing new. It's not a new subculture at all. So think kind of what's quite interesting about this is less so the fact that it's there on TikTok, and more the fact that TikTok is nurturing that subculture and allowing it to kind of thrive and develop, and to kind of bring it to new eyes, which is pretty exciting. So the next kind of niche I wanted to delve into is Fiat 500 Twitter. So again, if you're someone who's been on Twitter for a few years, you'll definitely have heard this phrase kind of thrown about. So essentially what it means, it's a bit of a stereotype based on women, typically in their kind of late teens, early 20s. Stereotype is they love a night out photo in front of the kitchen door, Chinese takeaway, chatting about boys, fast fashion, and Love Island. That's kind of like the main pillars. It's a massive stereotype. But I think what's quite interesting about Fiat 500 Twitter is, despite the fact it's a very active subculture, it's not something you seek out or you opt into or you opt out of. It's just kind of something that happens, and it's something that you are. And it's quite funny also, you've got Fiat 500 Twitter, but then you have Dark Fruits Twitter as well, which is basically the lads equivalent, which is quite interesting to see kind of how they develop. So this tweet here is an example of how someone who's part of Fiat 500 Twitter would typically talk. And you can see it's come from a parody account itself. Initially, I think Fiat 500 Twitter was a bit of a joke about the people as opposed to a subculture that they were part of. But I think it was season 4 of Love Island when it started trending, and kind of people became more aware of it than ever. And I think what's quite interesting now is it's snowballed to the effect where people are quite proud to be involved in it. People want to be associated with it. It's kind of common in terminology now, and brands especially, think about brands like in that fast fashion space, as we mentioned, that was one of the stereotypes about it. They've definitely been able to kind of jump on this and get involved in this subculture. So there's probably no more that you're aware of than the kind of big 3 of fast fashion. So Boohoo, Missguided, Pretty Little Thing, all of them have definitely capitalized on this Fiat 500 movement. You can see the example on the left, Boohoo have explicitly said Fiat 500 Twitter in a tweet from a week ago, so very, very recent. You've got Missguided, they're pulling in on this kind of relationship joke to create a meme and talk like how someone in that community would talk. And then on the right, you've got Pretty Little Thing, who's gone one step further, and their ambassador also represents that kind of subculture as well, being Molly May from Love Island. So it's really interesting to see how this kind of subculture has evolved from essentially a small internet joke into this massive opportunity for brands to really kind of reach the right people, speak like them, and just resonate with them really well. Cool. So the next kind of thing is just make sure you're adding value. So the idea of joining a subculture is great, but it's not all about you as the brand. You also have to think, how can I then add value to the subculture that I'm engaging with? What's in it for them that's going to make them kind of accept me and want me to be there? So a good example of this is looking at ways that brands have been adding value into that third space. So the third space is a sociology concept where we need 3 distinct spaces to feel happy and content. And typically this is home, work, and then a third space where you kind of interact with wider society. So a good example of this is the fictional coffee shop in Friends. Obviously over the past kind of year or so, haven't really been able to go to coffee shops with friends. So we found increasingly that people are going to kind of digital areas to find this third space through avenues like Pokemon Go or through Animal Crossing. So these kind of examples that you have here, you've got the Gucci North Face collaboration releasing these kind of items that you can get in the Pokemon Go game, and then on the right you've got Glossier have done like a skin that they can get their own personalized jumpers that they can have in the game. If you're a fan of the brand, that's something that's pretty valuable that you can then take that into your third space as well. And then on the other hand, you have a brand like KFC who kind of enter that third space but are also providing entertainment by streaming things on Twitch and kind of giving it that way. Cool. So my final example is just on MTV. Personally, I don't think there's a brand that really kind of delves into subcultures as well as MTV does, and that subculture is fandom. They do a really brilliant job of creating content for fandoms, engaging with the fandoms, acting like a fandom, and just really kind of bridging that gap between participating and kind of cultivating, which is pretty exciting to see. I mean, you can see on the left, Billie Eilish has posted just a random picture on Instagram, straight there in the comment, really positive, like nice vibes. You've got on the right, their kind of Twitter accounts. So Olivia Rodrigo releasing a new album, they comment, OMG, 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 like, it's very in keeping with how people would actually speak in that subculture. See above, sets every alarm because Julia Michaels has a new album coming out. It really means that they're adding value, but they also are that natural fit. They're not forcing anything. Like it's very, very authentic. And you can kind of see this, I guess, culminated in this example from the Taylor Swift subreddit. So there's a post here called MTV Fangirling at Queen, and it's a screenshot of MTV on a Taylor Swift lyric video. So again, you can see where they're having this presence. It's everywhere. It's Twitter, it's Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. They've now penetrated Reddit through their audience. And I just think it's like a really nice way to look at it, in that not only are they just partaking in the subculture, but the participation is actually kind of starting further discourse within that subculture. So you can kind of really see how that value has been added there just by something as simple as that comment there. Cool, and now just handing back to you, Sammy.
Cheers, Shawnee. So yeah, cultural codes. So this is all about how certain subcultures speak or communicate, produce content. So to build on and strengthen that sort of collective understanding within that particular group. So next slide, thanks. Right, I've picked these guys' Palace mainly because I wanted to pick a subculture that I am not part of. I'm not quite cool enough to wear Palace. I've definitely never skateboarded. I don't stand in queues for 4 hours on a Tuesday morning in Soho. So the point here is, why on earth would they direct their content to me? I'm not part of that subculture. So the point here is, if you speak to everyone, you actually end up speaking to no one. Next slide, thanks. And although I'm not, and you know, likely will never be part of that subculture, I can, I guess, as a guy in marketing, someone who sort of lives for answers behind why brands do certain things, I can appreciate that. Just like our mates Fred Perry, Palace have definitely cemented themselves long-term in some of the UK's leading youth cultures. You know, they've done this through an array of different techniques, mainly things such as collaborations. Check out their latest one with Stella after this event, if you like. And partnerships with really cool events. So it's like being seen at a party with a cool person. But I just wanted to pinpoint one thing on the next slide that I think is really interesting. They have this really unique way of communicating, of speaking to their subculture. And it's kind of like this sort of list, punchy, tongue-in-cheek cultural kind of tone that it seeks to speak to the few, not the many. So like, if you just look at the example on the left there, trying to make a connection between the copy, which is all around organic vegetables ain't doing themselves any favors, and an £188 jacket, it's tricky, right? Making that connection. I actually think that's the point. They're not really talking to me, are they? So that's absolutely fine that I don't fully get it. So what I really want you to get away from this is, if you want to fully commit to and build on a subculture as a brand, you've got to be brave. You've got to adhere to that subculture's codes, be bold and confident with how you address the room, if you like. It's okay not to be understood. It's okay, because taking the Palace example, I think, once Sam Carrick starts to really grasp what the hell Palace is talking about, I think that is the day that subculture then becomes unauthentic. Yeah, and effectively dies, right? Next slide, thanks. On the flip side, here's something I do understand, and that's arguably the greatest Facebook group ever invented. Something that could literally only exist on social, arguably only on Facebook groups. So look, there's a very select group of people in the UK and beyond that have this weird encyclopedic knowledge of David Brent and The Office. I am one of those people. I imagine, on this event, there might be 2-3 others, so they know exactly what I'm talking about right now. And I think in the past, you might meet 1, 2, maybe 3 people who appreciate that level of Office knowledge. But now, because of social, because of this sort of particular digital space, if you like, you can now interact with 16,000 other diehards. So yeah, what are its cultural codes? Well, just look at the name of the group alone. So I pose this question to everyone in this event: do you not know who Eric Kitchmo is? If the answer is no, that's okay. This group isn't for you. There are a million other subcultures better suited across a million other platforms, and that's the point that we're trying to get across. Next slide, thanks. And all it is, and just in case you're keen to try and be accepted in after this event, is they just turn reactive news into UK Office content. That's it. So there are admins who will approve content. So if your suggestion isn't quite perfect enough, then it just goes in the bin. So this isn't for people who just quite enjoy the UK Office. Actually, probably not for people who really like it. It's for those sad people like me who can sort of recite it backwards in their sleep. Next slide, thanks. And yeah, just bringing it back to like brands, social, these are 2 things that I think we can apply. It works for 2 reasons, and I think we can apply this to sort of any subculture brand industry. Firstly, it's reactive, such a social technique, all about responding to things that are current and pulling on those cultural codes to make it funny to its sort of super engaged members. And secondly, there's this real collective understanding, super important. You can't just sort of dip into this. This isn't like surface level stuff. This is like a deep knowledge and understanding of the subject matter and the cultural codes that go with it, which is why it works. Next slide.
Cool. So just wanted to kind of chat you through, I guess, a recent example of reactive collective understanding from Nando's. So TikTok on the left, that itself was a piece of reactive content, and it engages in Nando's own subculture with jokes about consumer behavior. So for example, taking a water glass and filling it up with tango on the sly. There's definitely a lot of kind of cultural codes that Nando's taps into there, and there's a lot of British humor. And where I guess the opportunity also was here, so you can see the comment on the right, we, I guess, partook in subculture within the terminology that we used in the comments as well. So you may know, you may not, but to ratio someone, it's a bit of a commenting game that happens on TikTok. It's pretty unique to younger audiences, typically TikTok, sometimes on Twitter, but you just don't really ever see it on Facebook, for example. So it's quite specific. And for a brand like Nando's to kind of engage with that game, with their fans in the comments, it's pretty unique, but it shows a demonstrable understanding of the platform subcultures, the cultural codes, and kind of how they speak, how they behave on that platform. And think like the main message to kind of take away here is that as a brand, it's just super important that any subcultures that you are engaging with feel authentic and that you are as immersed as possible, because that's the only kind of way to do it and really do it well.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to touch on this, as it is something that we hear at least a few times a week, especially when it comes to things like brands versus culture. And that is this perception that some brands just aren't sexy, or some brands are far sexier than others. And so this, this sort of like, well, what's the point feeling when it comes to trying to get into this subculture or niche? Next slide, thanks. So guys, say hello to Howard, the epitome of sexy in my eyes. Howard is a volunteer at the Sacramento History Museum in California, but that's not everything Howard is. He's also an absolute viral sensation. Next slide, please. He's the face of the museum's TikTok account that has recently just surpassed a whopping 1.2 million followers, which is absolute madness. And I think what's interesting about this is they probably spent the last 160 years trying to figure out ways of promoting their museum, billboards around the city, print ads in local papers. Maybe they got a slot on a local radio station. And then all of a sudden in 2020, TikTok blows up and everything starts to fall into place. And actually TikTok has been the savior of many museum galleries, especially since, the start of the pandemic, when doors have been closed. And I think that actually speaks volumes about the subcultures that TikTok itself has created. I think as a platform, it definitely has its own cultural codes. It definitely hosts content that potentially other platforms couldn't. So this sort of snackable content, this serves to briefly entertain or engage someone. So just this sort of nice 30-second to a minute break in your day to watch and learn something that potentially never even knew existed, right? So case in point, there's Howard and his 150-year-old printing press. And yeah, TikTok has given birth to this style of content. And as a result, I think these really niche, this is a guy talking about how to, like, old school printing methods. As a result, this niche subculture, no matter how sexy or unsexy they may seem, has largely been able to flourish. And I think the takeaway here, guys, is simply go and download TikTok and start scrolling, because you'll find something that will inspire you and that potentially you can learn from. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, and if Sexy Howard and his sexy printing press is an example of like a mega niche, tiny subculture that has grown massively organically, DHL and gaming is another example of maybe a perceived non-sexy brand getting into what is a hugely popular, dominant subculture, gaming. So DHL have been so solid, right, in their commitment to gaming, more specifically esports, that they've now gained genuine credibility in the space. They sponsor things like esports teams, they promote specific players, kit them out and all the stuff and give them all the equipment. And they also consciously focus on this idea of adding value, which is the guys have mentioned earlier, within that subculture. So things like the in-game unlocks and all that stuff, like exciting to gamers. And I think it's because of that, they've now gained this cult status almost amongst gamers. And I think the interesting thing here is gamers notoriously hate brands sticking their nose in, unless, of course, they are providing genuine value. And I think probably seemingly unthreatening, so like potentially where you lack in sexiness, you make up in unthreatening, and you can use that to your advantage. And I think that's why DHL can live in this space and almost be sort of welcomed into it. So yeah, I think I just want to close on this. So the next time you think my brand's not sexy, my brand's not cool, got no chance of making an impact, just think of lovely Howard and his impassioned videos about his press, and also a parcel delivery service with a yellow uniform that has been able to hit the glitz and glamour of esports. And now I'm going to actually pass back to Essie, who's going to summarize everything that we just spoke about, and then we're going to take some questions.
Brill, thanks guys. So there we are. Hopefully that kind of gave you a slightly better understanding of how you could tap into those different subcultures. So just to very quickly recap, the kind of guiding principles to scaling subcultures: natural fit and that long-term commitment. Don't just dip your toes in, but actually commit to the subculture and that you've chosen. Adding value, really understanding, what can you give back to the community, not just extracting value as a brand. And then finally, those really niche cultural codes. So how can you make sure that you speak the same language as they do? And so there's no kind of silenced brand moment once you start pushing content out there. So we've had a couple of questions come in so far. Let me just hop on. So I think we are going to kick off with going back to the basics. So I'm going to come to you first, Shawnee. If there's a question around basically, if I'm a brand or work for a brand that's never kind of got involved with any subcultures or any kind of community activity, how do I know which subcultures to align with?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is probably thinking about, is it that natural fit? And I guess if you still are like, what is that natural fit for me? I don't know. Start paying more attention to the existing community that you do have. What do they like? What don't they like? Does it feel like there's a commonality that's been unexplored? The other thing I would say is think about kind of the mission of your brand, the longer term goals, what subcultures feel authentic to that and might help you get to where you want to be as well. Just always make sure, I think, that it feels authentic and right for the brand, and that you're not just joining a subculture just kind of for the sake of it.
And there's kind of on that, there is a question around I guess reducing the risk involved in aligning your brand with a subculture. So I think, as marketeers, we're not in those subcultures ourselves. And there's always that chance of, we could completely be missing the mark when we're talking to these people. So like, how do we discover those different cultural codes for our desired subcultures or communities? Sammy, have you got any guidance there?
Yeah, I guess it's like, okay, so the first thing is just, make sure we're exploring what's out there, make sure you're sort of getting to grips with things like new platforms, cultural trends. And I think it's probably the people thing. Make sure you look at the team that you have, make sure that you're surrounded by people who are going to help you at least a step forward towards unlocking some of those subcultures. And yeah, just pull in resources and have fun with it, right? This is meant to be a time where, and I hope it was evident from this event, that we're all kind of discovering this stuff together. So yeah, I think those are the two things. First one is just explore, make sure you're immersing yourself in everything that you can do, and then reaching out and pulling on other resources, making sure the team around you is equipped, and yeah, not being afraid to sort of reach out from your immediate team and ask questions.
Great. There's quite a few questions around this reach point that I mentioned early on in the presentation as well. So essentially, what would you say to a brand who doesn't believe that there is an advantage to investing in niche subcultures because they value reach or awareness over everything else? Which I think is an interesting one. And people often, as I mentioned, there is this misconception that if you reach or if you're talking to a subculture, you can't generate mass reach. And that's not exactly right. Because first of all, these subcultures that live on TikTok, as you saw from some of those examples, Howard has 2.1 million followers, for example, even though it's about a very niche kind of printing press guy. So I think it's just about understanding that actually, due to these new platforms, the reach is much broader than it used to be. And secondly, I think going back to one of the other principles from another area of the social first brand white paper, which is about channel clusters. So understanding how does your content that generates reach work alongside the content with subcultures and other partners. So it's not just about speaking to one subculture and kind of putting all of your eggs in that basket, but it's about how can you then amplify that that content that is generated there and turn it into brand content as well, that can really act as that big awareness driver as well. There's also this question around B2B, and Sammy, I think we need a bit of clarification. What exactly do you mean when you say sexy versus non-sexy brand? And what do you think about B2B businesses, for example? Like, do they need to develop the same kind of strategy? And do you have any examples of that?
Right. Firstly, I knew that question would come up. I didn't make up that sexy brand thing. It's just a phrase that I hear a lot. Don't particularly like it, but I think I used it earlier, but it's basically just means a perceived like cool brand. So I think a sexy brand is probably one that has a quite an obvious Gen Z audience, that then will allow them to talk about all that. You had a slide of it before, Essie, where you had a picture of all these cultural things. If your key audience is that age demographic, then allows you to dip in and have fun with all the Fiat 500 stuff and stuff like that. But I think the whole point of this event is to sort of make it aware that, like, if you are a B2B account, I'm thinking like, what if you're like a law firm or whatever, by applying some of this thinking, exploring, seeing what's out there, like understanding of the capabilities of all these platforms, there will be a subculture that you can get involved with. B2B, I've seen success in the past where they've actually put their people at the front of their content. So like, what goes on behind the scenes, like put that personalization touch in it. Because I honestly believe that even sort of the most straight-laced B2Bs that potentially don't really have the capabilities of being funny can still create great content by putting people at the front of what they do. So yeah.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One of them is about how do you go about researching subcultures and ensuring that you have a really comprehensive understanding of them? And my personal advice would always be just literally talk to people, like try to get a sample of those people that you're, want to target and want to understand better. Talk to people in real life, meet them, understand where their passions lie and what they kind of want to hear from the brand as well. Social listening, community listening is really important, as Shawnee already alluded to. As well, and really just getting into the weeds of those different subcultures and communities, and kind of not being afraid to ask them real questions. And then finally, there is a question around luxury brands, which I think is an interesting one. So how can luxury brands get involved with subcultures, or can they? Because they tend to be quite rigid or strict with brand guidelines in particular. So can you think of any examples where luxury brands would have done that? I'm going to go to Shawnee first.
I don't know if I have an example, but I think you absolutely can, because I feel like being a luxury brand in itself, that's almost a bit of a, a high-end subculture. There's definitely lots you can do, and I don't think you have to kind of compromise on anything in terms of being that high-end luxury, more exclusive, just because you are engaging with a subculture. It maybe means that you just don't approach it in the way that a different brand would. I think you can uphold those brand guidelines and that kind of traditional tone of voice or way that you approach things within the subculture niches as well.
Brill, Sammy, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess just things like partnerships, collaborations, pick what's going on in the world and how can you sort of piggyback on stuff that's relevant will often help you get into a desired subculture. I'm thinking like Tag Her sponsor the timer at the top of like the Football Premier League, which probably will allow them to start talking in some sense. Probably not the best example, but yeah, I think Shawnee nailed it.
Brill, thanks very much. We are going to finish there. So that is the final event in our Social First Brand series. As I mentioned, the recording will be shared with everyone who's attended today, and you'll be able to find it on our website in the blog section, as well as you will be able to find all of the previous recordings of the events as well. So thank you very much for attending. If you have any thoughts, if your question didn't get answered, or you have any other questions, or just want to have a bit of a chat, you can get in touch at shout@bornsocial.co.uk. But thanks again very much for joining. Hope you get to enjoy the sunshine today. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Cheers.